Bless you. My name's Jeff Wendling with Faithful in Christ Ministries, and I'm thankful once again to have the opportunity to share God's Word with you today. When I was in middle school, probably 11 or 12 years old, we started to have what we called parties. And these parties would happen at friends' houses and so forth. And they were rather innocent affairs. We'd play music and dance at the time, and their parents were always there. We were at someone's home, and there would be soft drinks and snacks to eat. And it was around the time where boys began to recognize that there were girls and that there was something different about girls, and as boys were beginning to change. So it was fun to get together with everybody. And I remember hearing we'd play the Beatles. This was in the mid 60s, and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I Saw Her Standing There. Some of you remember these, and the Beach Boys, Fun, 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 and a lot of these songs. It was a great time to have a party. And I was going to my first one, and I remember being with my grandparents the day of that party, and I shared with them that I was going to a party tonight, and a lot of kids would be there, and we'd have fun. And my grandfather at that time reached into his pocket. He always had a pocket full of change, and he would, put a dime in the pop machine when a kid was around and stuff. But he pulled out a shiny 50-cent piece and he gave it to me. And he said, "Here, you can have fun with this. This is yours." He said, "You can spend it and it'll be gone, or you can keep it in your pocket. And if you do, you'll never be broke." I remembered my grandfather saying that. Now, he grew up in the Great Depression in the 20s. He was a German immigrant, and he understood what it meant to be broke. He had lived through those days, and he had worked hard, and he was a prosperous man. And so I considered that, went to the party, and ended up keeping that 50-cent piece in my pocket, and I didn't spend it. And to this day, I still have that 50-cent piece. If I was at home, I'd pull it out and hold it up and show it to you. And you know what else? He was right. I've never been broke. And I remember him, in my grown-up brain, the wisdom in that lesson he taught me. That was my first lesson in saving money at a very young age. And later in life, I remembered that lesson. And I began to keep, at one point, I began to keep a $100 bill in my wallet. And I put it in there and I said, "I'm not going to touch this." I remembered what my grandfather said. And I've kept a $100 bill in my wallet ever since, just to remind me of those times. I had that when I was in the leadership training program called the Way Corps. And we were on a strict budget at that time in residence. And so I never spent it, but I shared that with a lot of my brothers and sisters there, and they thought it was a great idea. And many of them started to save money and do that. And over the years, I've seen the benefits of saving money. And I think as a ministry, we have done a great job over the years of teaching, giving, and receiving, and sharing the benefits of that with people and seeing people prosper as they do that. But I don't think we've done such a great job of teaching people to save. Have you ever heard in your days in the Word anyone give a teaching on saving? I never have, but today you will. I'm going to share with you the benefits of saving money. We've been taught, maybe many of you have heard this in the past, and I know I have, and whether it was taught or not, some have spoken up and said that saving money is wrong. You shouldn't need to save money, because if you do, you're not believing God to supply your need if you're saving money. And, here's a news flash. Perhaps some of those things in the past we've been taught may not be right. So we need to look at some of this. And I thought today I wanted to share with you about savings. And, when we acknowledge that everything that we have is God's, everything we should be taught that a part of that is to save. God doesn't ever ask us to give everything we have, just a small part of it. And I think a part of that, I believe you'll see, is to save some money. We acknowledge all that God is ours to have, and He expects us to steward it, not only our finances, but the other things He's blessed us with, to steward those things, to take care of them, as well as to grow them. Turn to Matthew chapter 25. We'll begin here today. Matthew chapter 25. We're to handle our finances wisely, as well as stewarding them and watching them grow. In Matthew chapter 25, could begin in verse 15 or verse 14. Let's start in verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, and to every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. God has blessed each one of us with talents and abilities and finances according to our own several abilities. We all have unique parts within this body of Christ and unique things that we can do to contribute to it and to see it grow. And this is a parable showing that. And then he that received the 5 talents went and traded them with the same and made them another 5 talents. He doubled his money. And likewise, he that had received 2, he also gained other 2. He doubled his money as well. But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money. And after a long time, the Lord of those servants cometh and reckoned with them. And he that had received 5 talents came and brought the other 5 talents, saying, Lord, you gave me 5, and behold, I've gained beside them 5 talents more. And his Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee a ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. And he also that had received the 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou delivered unto me 2 talents. Behold, I've gained 2 talents more beside them. The Lord said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. And he went to the one that had received 1 talent. He came and said, Lord, I knew that you're a hard man, reaping where you haven't sown, or gathering where thou hast not strawed. And I was afraid, and I went and hid thy talent in the earth, and here it is. And his Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed, and gathered where I have not strawed, and thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received mine own with usury or interest. Take therefore the talent from him, give it unto him which hath 10 talents. For unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. And I believe the principle here is that those things that God has blessed us with, including our finances, are things that we're expected to steward faithfully and not be slothful. Who wants to be a sloth? Man, that's what he called this servant, that he was a slothful and a wicked servant. And we also need to grow it. And that's what we can do with our finances, is to steward them and to watch them grow, as well as the other abilities and things that God has blessed us with. Last week, Charlie shared with us about our vision as a ministry. He shared that it was to minister to the whole Christian, to be healthy in every way. Remember 3 John 2, a familiar scripture says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou wouldest prosper and be in health." Prosperity in the financial realm, our financial health is a part of that as well. And the principle of saving, stewarding, and growing those things God's blessed us with is also a part of a healthy financial and spiritual life for the believer. Throughout the Bible, we can see that many of the parables, many of the proverbs, many of the incidents that are shared with us in our Bible are shared in agricultural terms. Remember, like the sower and the seed, and different things like that. It was an agricultural society at that time that the people lived, farming and so forth, livestock and cattle. And a lot of the examples are geared around an agricultural society because that's what people would understand. A lot of Jesus's parables deal with agricultural things, planting and watering and so forth. And people understood that in that day because that was their culture. Now, in our culture today, it's much different. But if you would consider, say, a farmer, even a few years ago, maybe even today, but a farmer, he has several barns or storehouses that he keeps. He has a main barn, perhaps. There's a haymow. There would be a silo, a grain silo, other things, maybe a root cellar even, because a farmer would have to stock up and save. His way of life was to sow, to reap and harvest, and then to store for the winter time when he needed it. And in a lot of times past, if they didn't do that, they could starve to death. They saved up things in different storehouses that they had, barns, silos, haymows. There'd be a corn crib, and like I said, maybe a root cellar for storing things. Saving was a principle and a very vital part of life, saving that which they had. Our society and culture today is much different. We live in more of a commercial and industrial type of society where saving has not been encouraged. It hasn't been taught. And there's really not the need as there was in those times for us to save. If we need a gallon of milk, what do? Well, we got a super Walmart. And I know in our home, back home, there's one 5 blocks from our house. Go get a gallon of milk or an Aldi. The shelves are stocked, it's full. All you have to do is go and get it. And if you don't have the money, you can use a credit card. And if you don't have a credit card, I mean, that's easy for everybody. But if you don't have a credit card, then you can, there's food stamps. There's all kinds of programs that supply. So the need to save this day and time has not really been emphasized or taught in our society. In fact, some ways it's discouraged. If you save money, let's say you put it in a bank and you get interest, you've worked for that money and you're taxed on that money. And then if you save some and put it in a bank, it'll gain interest. And guess what? That interest is then taxed. So, it really hasn't been encouraged. And I think it's important. I think it's important to understand this. Go to Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6, beginning in verse 6. We'll see another example. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. And we'll see that wisdom and faithfulness is a huge part of establishing a pattern of saving and a storehouse in our own lives. And be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long will thou sleep, O sluggard? You see, we've seen a couple examples. A slothful man. What's a sluggard? I wanted to look that up and see because I didn't want to be a sluggard. A sluggard, it says the definition is someone who's irresponsible, lazy, and undisciplined. To save money requires being a responsible person. It requires wisdom to do that, faithfulness and discipline to save. But, if you've ever watched ants or studied ants, they have, I see them in my yard. You probably do too. I'll go out in the yard and there'll be a big pile. And my first instinct is to stomp it out and maybe put some 7 powder on it to kill them and get rid of those ants. They sometimes come up in cracks in the driveway. But, come back the next day and there's another pile. The ants don't stop, and they gather their food, and they have all these tunnels underground. So if you stomp one out, there's more, and they come back. But they keep working. If you've ever watched them work, I've seen small, teeny ants carry huge pieces of crumbs of food or something and take it and drag it down into their hole, and they store it and they save it for the time when they won't be able to gather. It's a great example of the ants and also of the sluggard or the slothful man, as we read in Matthew, the slothful servant who didn't bother to grow or save or set aside. Consider the ant, thou sluggard. Our lives have seasons too. And I don't think that there's any one of us who can say you've never been through a financial winter in your life. Haven't we all experienced at one point or another some type of a financial winter? The ant, the squirrels even know how to save and stock away for those times. And believe me, they're going to come. Those of us who have lived in this life a while have seen them, and the financial winters of life could come. And at those times they do, it's good to have a savings account so we can weather those financial winters. Many years ago, there was one of our board members shared a book with us on the board of Faithful in Christ Ministries. Book was called The Storehouse Principle, and it was written and shown specifically, more generally, to churches and ministries and religious organizations and so forth, and how they could set up a storehouse, showing several examples from the Word, which I'd like to show you today. But as we each had a copy of the book and we read the book, we thought it was a great idea, and we decided to implement that principle within our ministry of having a storehouse. And we did that, and we determined at that point in time, this was several years ago, 15 years or more ago, that we started it with a $25 deposit. And in the years since, we have seen that grow exponentially for us as a ministry. And I believe that a storehouse is the financial basis for a healthy, prosperous, and effective ministry. I believe it's the financial basis for that. And in addition to that, I believe it could be the financial basis for a healthy, prosperous, and effective Christian, the whole Christian, having a storehouse. Let's turn to Malachi chapter 3. This is perhaps the most common verse that you've thought about when I mentioned a storehouse. It's one that I think most of us are very familiar with. Malachi chapter 3. And we begin in verse 6, where we read, I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore, ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. That's important to remember, that God doesn't change. We'll read a lot of records today from the Old Testament, some from the Gospels, but it's important to recognize that God doesn't change. The things that work, the principles he set up, are eternal principles. He says, I'm the Lord, I don't change. Verse 7, even from the days of your fathers are you gone away from mine ordinances and have not kept them. Return unto me, and I will return unto you, saith the Lord of hosts. But you said, wherein shall we return? Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, wherein have we robbed thee? And he said, in tithes and offerings. You see, the people had been withholding from God, robbing from God. They haven't been faithful in their giving of their tithes and their offerings. In verse 10, then bring ye all the stores, all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. The storehouse and God's house at that time was in the temple, and that's where they would bring the tithes and the offerings. The temple was the place where it was a place of God's presence and a place where God was worshiped, and that sets a precedent for a ministry or a church having a storehouse. So there could be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there will not be room enough to receive it. And a part of that, a part of receiving that blessing and bringing the tithes and the offerings in, is to have some of it in a storehouse, to be able to serve and to be able to do the things of God. You bring the tithes and the offerings, put them in a storehouse, you receive a blessing, and then also in verse 11, you receive the protection. I'll rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time, saith the Lord of hosts. Another example, and in the Bible, there's several words for the storehouse. Storehouse is one of them. Sometimes they're called barns. In other places, the word is translated treasuries or treasures, even armories. There's a lot of different words for places to store abundance that God's given us. We'll look at a few of these examples. Turn to 2 Chronicles. And this is just one. This is an example of Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles, chapter 32, the example of Hezekiah. And you'll see some of the uses of this word for the storehouse. Verse 27, 2 Chronicles 32, verse 27, and Hezekiah had exceeding much riches and honor, and he made himself treasuries, that's storehouses, for silver and gold, for precious stones, and for spices, and for shields, and for all manner of pleasant jewels. Storehouses, verse 28, also for the increase of corn and wine and oil, and stalls for all manner of beasts, and coats for flocks. Another thing we'll see here, verse 29, let's read this. Moreover, he provided him cities and possessions of flocks and herds in abundance, for God had given him substance very much. God was the one that Hezekiah acknowledged for his great abundance in life, in the material things. God had blessed him, and he set aside storehouses for these things, and he saved. And something you'll notice as we go through these references is that storehouses is always used in the plural. There's always more than one, and people can have storehouses, more than one, too, for different purposes, individuals. And we'll see, I think that's a pretty good idea. Hezekiah had several storehouses. David also had storehouses. You could read this account. We won't go there in 2 Samuel, but he set aside materials in storehouses to build the temple that his son Solomon would eventually build. And over the years, he accumulated those materials and things in storehouses for the building of the temple. Genesis chapter 41. This is another great example, and maybe another one we're familiar with. Genesis 41 records some of the story of Joseph. And as you know, Joseph had been cast into prison. He was unjustly and wrongly accused, and he had been in prison for some time. He became a servant to the captain of the guard in prison and had interpreted dreams for a couple of fellow inmates there that came to pass. And he asked them that they would remember him, and they didn't. And time went on. He was still in prison. And then Pharaoh at that time had dreams himself. He had two dreams. You remember the two dreams that he had? One was that there were 7 fat cows and 7 skinny, ugly cows, and the skinny, ugly cows came and ate the fat cows, and they still looked skinny and ugly. And then the other one was that there was some ripe, huge, big ears of corn, and then there was lousy ears of corn without much yield and scrawny looking, and they ate the fat ears of corn. And Pharaoh was troubled by this, called all the wise men in his kingdom, and nobody could tell him what those dreams meant. He was getting frustrated. And then the one of the men that Joseph interpreted the dream for in prison remembered him and told him, and they went, and Pharaoh called for Joseph, and he came, and indeed Joseph interpreted those dreams for him. He said, Pharaoh, God has given me the answer of peace for Pharaoh. And the dreams portrayed 7 years of plenty and prosperous and abundance, and then 7 years of terrible famine coming up. And Joseph told Pharaoh the dreams are one. They both meant the same thing. And he said, what you should do, Pharaoh, is find someone who is wise and discreet and set aside in storehouses abundance over those 7 years of plenty, because when the famine comes, we'll need it. And Pharaoh was very impressed with this, and immediately he made Joseph on the spot the number 2 in charge to only him in the whole land of Egypt. And he gave him a ring, and he gave him this position, and he told him, go ahead and set this up, which Joseph did. And in Genesis 41, we can see in verse 34, Joseph says, let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. So in this case, they were taking up 20% of all the food, and then and all the grain and everything to store up for the times of famine that were to come. And verse 36, we can read, and that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine. And you know, it's interesting, nobody saw this coming. Not Pharaoh, not the wise men. Nobody saw this time of famine coming until God revealed it to Joseph, and he shared it with Pharaoh. And Pharaoh gave Joseph the task to implement this plan of saving in storehouses the abundance during the good times. And then we can read what happened in verse 56 of chapter 41. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And the countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because all the famine was so sore in the land. And a couple of things that strike me as really interesting in this account is how quickly the situation of a person, an individual, can change, how quickly God can work in situations to change an individual's situation. Joseph went from being confined to a prison overnight to being the number 2 most powerful man in the land. And the other thing that I see here in this record is when he did open the storehouses that had all this food and all this grain during the time of famine, he didn't just say, come on in, we'll give it to you. He sold it to the Egyptians, sold it to them. They had to pay for it. And then he sold it to the other countries as well. They came and bought corn. And as a result of this, as a result of these storehouses and the way that Joseph administered it, all the wealth of the entire populated world at that time came into the land of Egypt. And it was pointed out to me at one point that perhaps when the children of Israel finally left the bondage of Egypt and God led them out, that by the time the last plague was there, they were saying, take it, take the gold, take the silver, take everything, and get out of here with it. And they did. That's exactly what they did. They gathered it all and headed to the promised land that God had promised them. All of this came around about because Joseph had the revelation to set up these storehouses. Each city had one, and they set up storehouses and saved for that winter season of life, that famine that was to come. Proverbs chapter 8. We'll look at some more of these. Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs in chapter 8 here we see is written from the perspective of wisdom speaking. And when it comes to saving and putting money aside and indeed handling our finances in every way, it requires wisdom. But as wisdom speaks in Proverbs chapter 8, he says in verse 19, wisdom says, my fruit is better than gold, yea, than fine gold, and my revenue than choice silver. I lead in the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of judgment, that I may cause those substances, that I may cause those that love me to inherit substance, and I will fill their treasures. Did I give you that verse? Have you been able to follow? That I may cause those that love me to inherit substance, and I will fill their treasures. The word there for treasures is also the word used for storehouses. Storehouses. He'll fill those, but it begins with wisdom and how we handle this and the wisdom that God can give us to do so. Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9 says, honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. This is the part of giving, the first fruits, and honoring God through giving. And as we do that, verse 10, so shall thy barns, and that's storehouses, thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. The people had barns, and God says here that as you give and as you see the blessings as a result of your giving, I'll fill your barns. I'll fill that up so you will have abundance to keep and to save for those winters and the storms of life that may come. Barns. Another one is Deuteronomy chapter 28. You see, when I recall at a well, let's read Deuteronomy, and then I'll tell you what I recalled, if I recall it. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 1. And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God. This is Moses speaking to the children of Israel before they are to leave and before they're to enter the promised land. The Lord thy God, if you'll observe and do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations in the earth. And all these blessings shall come on thee and shall overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. I thought that was a cool verse. Can you imagine that? Blessings coming upon you and overtaking you, if only we listen to the voice of God. I just think that wording is great. Come upon you and overtake you. Blessed shalt thou be in the city, blessed in the fields. Blessed shalt thou be the fruit of thy body, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of thy cattle, the increase of thy kind, and the flocks of thy sheep. Blessed shall thy basket and thy store. Blessed shall be. The basket is what you gather and what you have. The store is where you keep it. The storehouse. Blessed shall thou be when thou come in, when you go out. The Lord shall cause thine enemies to rise up against thee and be smitten before thy face, and they shall come out against thee one way and flee before thee 7 ways. The Lord shall command the blessing upon thee in thy storehouses, and in all that thou settest thy hand to do, and he shall bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God gives. Remember, we read God doesn't change. He could do that for the children of Israel. He can do that for us today. He can command a blessing upon our storehouses. Now, before he can do that, we need to have a storehouse or storehouses. And if we do, then he is able to command that blessing. Bless everything we do. Whatever we set our hand to do, God can bless it. If we have set up a storehouse, he can command that blessing upon it. You know, several years ago, we were having one of our clergy elder fellowships. I can't remember, this might have been 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, at one of them. And I was explaining to our leadership the principle of the storehouse and why we as a ministry had a storehouse. And while I was explaining that and going over it, I was asked a question from one of the leaders there. What is actually the purpose of the storehouse? And at that point in time, I didn't have an immediate answer. And it bothered me. And it bothered me for years that I didn't have an immediate answer. I wanted a better answer than, well, we all read a book, we liked it, and decided to do it. I wanted a better answer than that. And that's what I've wanted to do with you and for you today, is to provide and to be able to share the heart, the purpose, and the benefits of a storehouse, both for our ministry and for you, for each one of us as an individual. That was what I wanted to be able to do today for you. Let's go to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. First of all, the heart of a storehouse. Let's read Luke chapter 12. We'll begin in verse 16. And he spoke a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. Luke 12, verse 16. You see, here again is another agricultural incident, and a parable shared in agricultural terms. The ground of a rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, this will I do. I'll pull down my barns or storehouses and build greater. And there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? And so is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. This is not the heart we want to have as we set up our storehouses, as we have a storehouse. You know, I got plenty now. I can just sit back and eat, drink, and be merry. It was the wrong heart. God called that man a fool in this parable. What we want to be is rich toward God. And if we have that attitude of being rich toward God, if we let his word dwell in us richly, as Colossians 3:16 says, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another, as we have that attitude, we can see the purpose of a storehouse and the heart of a storehouse. And the heart is related to the purpose as well as the benefits. And I'll show you that in just a moment, real briefly. But, you know, you can see throughout this the contrast of a sluggard, of a sloth, of a fool, as opposed to those who have the wisdom that God can give us to set up our storehouses. And to those who say, if you have a storehouse, if you're saving money, you're not believing God, I say, yes, you are believing God. When your heart is everything that we have is God's, and we're here to steward it and to see it grow, we have believed him. We've believed him with diligence, faithfulness, and wisdom to set up a storehouse for those winters of life. So when they can come, we can say, thank you, God, you've provided for this. We've prepared for that. The purpose of a storehouse, I believe, number one, is to have to give. To have to give and to serve. And as we do, God can give us even more. He doesn't expect, remember, us to give everything, only a small part, only a part of that which he's blessed us with. He does expect us to do that, as well as set some aside for those winters when they come. Remember, his blessings come upon thee and overtake thee. And we've also read in Malachi that he'll open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that there won't be room enough to receive it. God can still do these things for each one of us. Another purpose of the storehouse is preparation for those winters of life. And believe me, they'll come. And I think we've each experienced at least once or more in our life those winters of life financially. You know, I was thinking about this with our ministry. I was here in Florida, where I am right now, a year ago, just a year ago today, and I'm able to continue to stay on top of our ministry finances through the high-tech age of electronics and computers and internet and so forth. And I was checking our bank account one morning. I got up and I was checking it and making entries in the ledger and so forth. And I saw, to my surprise, that our checking account that we use for the ministry stood at a balance of $75. And that shocked me because usually it's quite a bit more. But thankfully, at that time, we were able to draw on what we had put aside in the storehouse to replenish that checking account. We had had some unexpected large expenditures at the time that came up rather suddenly that we needed to handle, but we had that storehouse, and it enabled us to continue the functions of the ministry seamlessly. We didn't have to grit our teeth and wonder where this money was going to come from. We had it. We had saved it. We had used the wisdom that we learned and put it aside for that time when we needed it. Individuals can have the same things come up. You know, you've all seen it. There's car repairs. All of a sudden, a tire blows out, or a battery goes dead, or something like that happens with our cars or our home. Recently I had to replace our entire furnace and air conditioning unit and water heater in our house at home. And it was quite a pricey proposition to do that at the time. But fortunately, I had a storehouse for home repairs, and I was able to pay cash for that and take care of that without worrying about it. Those things come up for individuals. So these principles of a storehouse will work for a ministry, it'll work for a business, and it'll work for each one of us as individuals. My friend Robert Wilkinson would always say, it worked for me, it'll work for you. Also, with the ministry purposes for the storehouse, outreach and ministry, I mean, we have financed many trips to El Salvador, trips to Maine, outreach trips to Oregon and Colorado to go different places and bless believers. So outreach is one of the purposes that we can use the finances for. We also have a storehouse for benevolence, that in certain situations we're able to give and to help believers when unforeseen emergencies come up and they genuinely need help handling these things. We also are coming up on our clergy elder conference. We have the funds to fully pay for that, to have our leadership come in and be blessed for a weekend at a nice camp. The only thing we ask is that they provide for their way to get there. And as the ministry, we'll take care of the food, the housing, and everything else for a great weekend in the Word with our leadership. And also for future needs in the ministry as God directs us. Sometimes we don't know what He wants us to do. And for many years since we began this ministry, what I've shared often is that when God asks us to do something, when we believe and know that God wants us to do something, that finances will never stay in the way of us accomplishing that which He wants us to do. And you know what? All these years later, it never has been an issue. A lot of that is due to the faithful, abundant sharing of all of you where we're able to do that. But it also comes from we take great pride in the wisdom that God shows us collectively as a group to steward that which He's given to us, as well as putting some of it faithfully each month in a storehouse. For individuals, some of the purposes could be providing for your family for future events, maybe saving for a kid's college. If something happens to one or the other of the spouse, would your spouse be taken care of? A storehouse can provide for that, for just basic retirement, maybe planning for a vacation, something like that. And also, a principle in the Word is to be able to leave something to our children, to leave something behind for our children. A storehouse can be a great source of that as we save. And then just simply preparing and saving for the future. And finally, the benefit of having a storehouse. I think the greatest benefit in having a storehouse or a savings account, if you will, is the peace you'll have knowing that God has provided for your storehouse and will continue to provide and supply your needs. God will provide for that storehouse as we plan for that and continue to faithfully, with wisdom, fund that storehouse. It leaves us free. That peace leaves us free to focus our energy and efforts to do God's will and His work without having to fret when these things do come up in life. We won't need to worry or concern ourselves with where the money's going to come from when the winters and storms of life come up, as God has already provided that for us. In closing today, there's many ways that a storehouse can be set up. And of course, probably the first one you've thought about is through a bank, a savings account, which will pay interest. And at this point in time, they're paying a pretty good amount of interest in a savings account. One of the storehouses that Brenda and I have is a health savings account. And this is something that the government, you can set it up through a bank and contribute money to it that is deductible from your taxes and have cash for these medical emergencies that may come up, for drugs and glasses and dental and things like that that aren't covered maybe. But a health savings account is another way of a storehouse. Banks, savings accounts, CDs are one way too, a certificate of deposit for a period of time that will gain interest for you. And other ways. There's other, maybe it's just a bank bag in your drawer in the bedroom that you put a little extra change into here and there, or a jar in the kitchen that when you come home, throw a little extra change in it. If you have a storehouse, if you've set this up, a method of saving, and you've done it diligently, you know what I'm talking about. You know this is true, and you know the peace that you can have in having that set aside. If you don't have a storehouse, then just start small. I would encourage you to set something up. Start small, believe God, be faithful and diligent in setting up your storehouse, and then watch Him bless it and watch it grow. God bless you.